Hello and welcome to Digital Marketing Musings, hosted by Merkle. Each episode, we choose a different expert to share the latest and greatest in digital marketing trends.
Today, we're interviewing Ilon Weeldreyer, Steve Pomeroy, and Jason Meek about all things attribution. All right, let's get to it. I'm Gaia Reed.
And I'm Andrew McCartney.
And this is Digital Marketing Musings.
Welcome back to Digital Marketing Musings, Season 2, and our last episodes of the season. Today, we're joined by Ilon, Steve, and Jason to talk about attribution.
We have truly an all-star guest lineup for today's conversation. So Ilon Weeldreyer is a director of performance media and helps lead Merkle's media capability for display and paid social. Steve Pomeroy is the VP of Audience and Media Analytics, supporting the CPG, retail, and B2B verticals for Merkle. He's got 12 years of experience in finance, pricing, merchandising, supply chain, and marketing analytics. Jason Meek is a seasoned marketing analytics professional with over 20 years of experience working across various industries: auto, CPG, retail, entertainment, finance, healthcare. I'm sure there's more. For the last 10 years, he's focused specifically on media effectiveness and working with clients to maximize their media impact while removing less efficient tactics. And he currently leads the attribution practice for Merkle, which is obviously perfect for this episode. So welcome to our show, everyone.
Hey, how's it going?
Nice to be here.
Yeah, excited to be here.
So this episode is the first in a two-part series on attribution and measurement. We're tackling this topic as really an age-old marketing problem that continues to plague us, is something that, we always grapple with across accounts. We have touched on some elements of attribution across various episodes, including ones on the GA4 transition earlier this year. And as Ilon on the line had visited us talking about the cookieless future episodes. But we haven't actually dedicated coverage around, how to think about attribution for your accounts from more of a holistic sense. So with that background, to start with, could you all reiterate, what we mean when we say attribution? So how do average marketers and teams typically think about measurement on their accounts, particularly with focus on digital channels?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think when we think about attribution, really we're talking about understanding the journey in which, consumers take to get to that final conversion in that business action, whether it be a site visit, an actual purchase, or a lead that's generated, right? And where are they coming from? Like what channels or what media is actually driving that person, or should we, air quotes, attribute credit to? So that's kind of the generic, way in which to start thinking about when we talk about attribution, putting a frame around it. And then, from a ideal, or, I shouldn't even say ideal, but more so, most commonly used model standpoint, last touch attribution is one that's just kind of been the age-old standard. Although the bane of, I'm sure, of the rest of my fellow guests' existence, it's something that we have to contend with constantly.
And for someone who doesn't know, can you describe what last touch means?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can think about it as, a consumer will go through the journey, right, of they'll be either watching linear TV, driving their car, seeing out-of-home billboards, maybe interacting with their social media. And throughout all these different experiences, they'll get touched by the brand or by a given retailer or, some other company that's trying to convince them that their offering is what they need to either sign up for or convert. And each one of those touch points then leads up to what we hope is the conversion. And so that last touch point, if you will, usually search or some sort of digital channel in which we can track. Again, trackability, I think, Jason will come on here in a little bit, talking a little bit more about how we can work around that. But trackability when it comes to digital channels is really key. And that's really when last touch comes into play. It's that last trackable channel that happens before that conversion.
Got it. So that last trackable channel will just get 100% of the credit for that conversion action, whereas all of those previous interactions leading up to that one would get 0% credit in the last touch attribution.
Yep, that's absolutely right.
What are some of the more commonly used models that are not last touch?
Yeah, so I'd love to hear Jason's thoughts on this. I mean, I think you have anything from MTAs to MMMs. but I'll let the master speak.
Yeah. I mean, the easiest place to start, like Steve said, is looking at how your specific campaign or tactic is doing and trying to understand the lift in that, right? Last click is the next step from that, which looks at the other side, and it looks at the conversion as opposed to the media exposed and says, this conversion happened, what affected it? And can I track what media would have driven that, right? So if it's digital, yes, paid search, display, some of those things that they're clicked on, you can track to say this got last touch credit. But if you're looking at a digital only type of solution, things like direct mail or a billboard, those would never get credit, right? Mm-hmm. So from a kind of a fractional attribution standpoint, we have a couple different ways we look about it. One is looking at it in aggregate. So we don't really care to say, did Jason Meek see this paid search ad, or did he click on this online video and then do an action, right? We look and say, was there spend in this market that happened on this day? And were there conversions that happened, or revenue or site clicks or any of those things happening within a certain time frame that we should say that this specific online video should get credit? So that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is then from the individual standpoint to say, can I actually say that this conversion saw this online video or saw this specific display ad, and link that to a specific individual or person or device and say, how much credit should I be giving to this? And should it be getting credit? And what else was happening that didn't get credit? Because in the space of attribution, it's not only trying to give marketing how much credit they should get, but how much of that conversion would have happened even without marketing. And with more sophisticated modeling approaches, we can quantify that portion as well. So last click is giving 100%. Fractionalized or deterministic is dividing that 100% about what we know happened. And then even deeper modeling says, actually 60% of that conversion would have happened regardless. And here's the 40% and the campaigns that would have gotten credit for that.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And when an average marketer is thinking about often we'll come onto an account and they already have some sort of attribution model determined for that account. So they're not really having to make this decision. But if they are in a position where they're able to actually influence which attribution model is chosen, what does the average marketer team usually go with, or what mindset are they using to choose?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear Ilon's thoughts on this, because I feel like this is the thing that we have to deal with on a regular basis when we're onboarding new accounts. Usually it's the two of us in a room trying to figure out, okay, what data do they actually have, and how are we actually going to make sense of that, right? We'll inherit, what we were just talking about with Jason, a last touch model usually. Sometimes if we're lucky, they have some sort of ad server or additional tech that kind of lets us look across various different platforms. And I think that's another piece, Jason touched on it just briefly there, that's really important too, is what can the technology see? And so what I mean by that is, can the technology, or are you using a platform level model, i.e. are you using Meta, for example, in which case Meta can only look on the platforms it has? Or are you able to actually use and utilize like a site analytics or an ad serving platform, in which case you can see an even broader spectrum of models and different touch points? And so I think that's kind of the initial piece for us is, obviously some sort of fractional credit or deterministic model that can actually spread out the wealth and understand, what is a given consumer seeing across their journey versus just that individual platform is, case study number one. And then maybe even using a combination of those models. I've seen some success where, an individual platform like a Meta might actually leverage a last touch model to really drive conversions and let the algorithm really optimize towards, getting as many people in the funnel as possible, while an ad serving model might actually look across and balance out, like if programmatic is getting less credit or more versus search, something of that nature. But Ilon, I know you and I have dealt with a number of these before, so I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, I would say it's a good best practice for a digital program to use an ad server. And so, as Steve mentioned, what an ad server does is, for our display ads, you can host those assets within an ad server, although you don't need to. And what happens is, when a user interacts with one of our ads, either when an ad is loaded in the display environment or when a user clicks, and that can be either on a display ad or actually with a paid search ad, a cookie or some sort of deterministic ID is used to identify the user, and then later on, when that user visits the advertiser site, they can match up that previous interaction to a site conversion. And the reason this is a good best practice is because you get that intra-channel and inter-channel view of what's happening. So within display, you can see how many conversions are being attributed to prospecting or remarketing tactics, how many conversions are being attributed to paid search, and all of that is deduped. So you know that if you were looking at just a single platform view from any one channel, say if you were only using Google Ads conversion tracking for paid search and you were not using that through the ad server, you would assume that you're probably duplicating a lot of conversions that you're reporting. And so what that allows you to do is first dedupe those conversions, make sure you're not over-reporting. But then also the ad server can have a lot of useful built-in features. So a lot of the models that Jason, Steve talked about, things like last touch or first touch, linear, DDA, so data-driven attribution that uses previous historical data to do sophisticated modeling and assume credit. All of those things are available via the ad server. Most platforms have their own methods for modeling. And so using Meta as an example again, they have the ability for comparing windows. So windows, attribution windows, whether it be 28-day click, 7-day click, 1-day click, 1-day view. And through that, you can triangulate what you think you're seeing in terms of performance. And that's where the art of it comes in, the art of looking at the data and interpreting it and analyzing it. And then back to a previous comment about the advertiser and agency or analytics team mission of working with other teams within the brand's overall marketing and finance operation. So what I mean by that is there has to be a conversation about what source of truth is going to be used to understand performance. So there is the platform views that we already covered in terms of what are the data signals we can see. And then beyond that, it's a choice of the brand's marketing team and ultimately the brand's decision makers of what source of truth they're going to trust. Is it going to be something like an ad server that has a cross-channel view? Is it going to be a site analytics suite that only sees URL parameters? That's the other aspect of it. That's more of an art or a negotiation.
And just to make sure we're all starting the conversation on the same foot too, because we referenced campaigns a little bit earlier in one of the comments, but when we're choosing an attribution model, is that something that might vary by campaign, or maybe the settings for the attribution model, like how many days in the look back window are set by campaign or campaign type, like an awareness campaign versus a conversion driven campaign? Or is that something that's really set kind of overall for an entire program?
So from my standpoint, we've changed the attribution or decay window based on by channel, right? When you're looking at something as simple as like looking at a specific campaign, you may determine how long you may think that campaign may be effective, right? Mm-hmm. As Ilon said, platforms have got some of their own standards of how they kind of constitute it, whether it's 28 days or 6 months. They all kind of change on how much time they want to take credit for, right? When we model, we typically look at a similar look back window when we look at something like multi-touch attribution, where we say all of the media, whether it's digital or first party being like direct mail or email, driving a specific conversion, whether online or offline, we would allow up to 90 days. That doesn't mean that we're going to allow every single channel 90 days of impact, but we are going to allow that much into the model to determine what the impact is of each. That being said, the effects of something like paid search, all of those typically happen within the first week or 2 weeks in regards to driving conversion, as opposed to display, which may peak at week 3 or 4, or something like online television, which may also be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, right? Or direct mail, which could have multiple weeks. And so when we build our multi-touch attribution solutions, we bake a lot of that into the back end of that, so that our clients don't have to actually know, or the marketers don't have to know, thinking about how does this all work and how does it level set, because that's in there. But those types of things are taken into account when thinking about how long are the effects of my media if I place them in market. So that's something also to consider as well.
So this kind of brings into other questions. What are common pitfalls of approaches of attribution and measurement that marketers are taking today? So and I guess also, how does this impact results by channel?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really great point. I have to, harken back to some of the things we were just talking about. It's just too much of a one size fits all, sort of mentality around, every channel just the question was just asked, every channel having to maybe match, whether it's their attribution windows or their logic.
Right.
And there may be intentionality around, how we can actually split that apart, right? So what Ilon was just talking about, there may be a differentiator between what an ad server is doing versus what a site analytics tool is doing. And there may be a purpose for that, right? And I think being okay with that, being able to articulate that is our role, right? And we have to kind of help the marketers and our clients kind of get there, but also from the standpoint of being able to clearly define exactly which channel has what intent and what they're trying to do. So, for example, with search, I wouldn't say you'd ever stretch that search window past 7 days. And I think all of us kind of inherently know that. But if you're thinking about it, abstractly, I think search as a mechanism is something that's right at the end of the funnel. It's the tip of the spear right before you have a conversion event happening. It's not something. I don't think all of us find ourselves spending time, just cruising around on google.com and just kind of seeing what pops up, right? I think that's kind of what inherently you say it and it sounds a little funny, but, then when you talk to marketing teams, it's like, oh yeah, okay, well, let's put ourselves back in reality. And I think that's sometimes when you're trying to articulate those points back to the teams, right? It's like, what is that realistic interaction with that ad type and that intention going to be, And then from that, how do we think that fits within the broader journey? Finding synergies and comparable numbers is always Jason's and my goal, right? To be able to call balls and strikes. But sometimes there is that art that Ilon was mentioning around, how do we actually mesh all of these things together to paint a holistic picture?
Specific things to watch out for that are pretty common are a lot of times marketing teams need to answer to finance teams. And finance teams prefer to have a very clear picture. They want a very clear source of truth. They don't necessarily like the answer of, well, it depends, or your company is this, or these sort of interpretations of data. They want very clear data.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that's where it falls back on the site analytics data. And so as already mentioned, those a lot of times rely on what's visible in the URL. And most of your traffic is coming through, all of your traffic is coming through either a SERP or a direct load or a click on an ad. And any of us who know about click-through rates on display ads or paid social ads, it's very, very few, or it's very, very low. And so what you get from that perspective of using that data is a distorted view of what's actually going on. Click and view, they're truly only interaction types. And any click has to be a view first. And this is the part that's missed. And so when we're looking at data, if we were to advise marketing teams and finance teams, almost universally, we would say you're overvaluing your click data versus where your funding should be more in your demand driving display, video, those sorts of channels. And so that's probably the biggest challenge and pitfall of a particular type of attribution data is that click only data. Over the years, the tide has started to turn, but it's very slow because digital marketing as a channel is relatively new to marketing. And a lot of those teams on the brand side, they are slow to adapt whereas the marketing teams are much faster. What do I want to test next, that sort of thing. So they're in the nature of rapid changes, whereas the finance teams are not. Steve, Jason, would you agree with all of that?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that a lot of marketers rely heavily on direct data, right? So I'm following this pixel from when it happened through to the process, right? And that has been the standard for the last 15 years to the last 5 years as digital has increased their budgets by thousands of X, right? But now because of pixel blocking and different regulation that's happening out there, we're having to go back to where we used to be, which is more like media mix and looking at things from an indirect standpoint to say, yes, a bunch of display exposures happened, but what is the indirect effect of having that? So you're having to go back to more aggregate modeling to understand kind of what is the relationship of these things that are happening, as opposed to just saying, hey, I'll just follow the pixel. It'll tell me what's going on, right? Because that's just not where it used to be, even 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, for the past 10 to 15 years, the cookie really did help display in being able to have that visibility. But that's absolutely true. With that loss of signal, it needs to go back to more big data analysis of what's going on.
And I'm sure too, back to the initial comment on this question of we're taking a very one-size-fits-all approach as kind of the standard today. If you even ask any SEM team, we're talking about search as an overall channel, but even within the different types of campaigns that most advertisers are running, the difference between a non-brand campaign of terms or shopping campaign versus a branded campaign, the actual incremental attribution impact to the brand from a branded versus non-branded standpoint is going to look very different. So it's helpful to keep that context in mind and not just think about it all in one bucket.
Attribution is not a one size fits all, right? And I would even say that from industry to industry. It changes from client to client because everybody uses their media differently, how they drive people, where they drive them to. Is it to a lead? Is it to an app? Is it to an online visit? Is it to a store? So everybody's using it, and everybody has, speaking specifically of finance, has different KPIs that they believe are the golden rule or the golden ticket that are going to drive their business, right? And so being able to adjust for that is part of what we have to do, is not even having the right terminology as we go from client to client, but also knowing what's driving their business, where it's driving them, how big of an impact that is, and making sure that we right size our attribution solutions for each of them differently.
We don't want to seem like we're projecting a position of search doesn't actually do anything. Not anybody can attest to non-branded search working very well. I want black pants. I just want men's black pants. What am I going to do? And if I see an ad at the top of the SERP, it definitely affects me. Same thing with the research done around defending turf on branded terms. Just to be clear, we wouldn't say that search isn't effective, but it's just probably overrepresented a little bit. And Gaia and Andreah, with your background, I'm sure you can more expertly weigh in there.
We're biased as people with heavy search backgrounds, but yeah, I'm sure many of the statements that we've even made on the episode so far, like the relative attribution length, if you're thinking about selling high tech or, something that has a very long lead time, if you're buying a car, right? Like I'm sure the lead times, depending on vertical and everything, are going to impact all of these minute decisions that we're talking about that are going to go into what we actually recommend for the attribution.
Absolutely. Things like, another good example, you said, so long consideration windows, right? So like buying a car, student loans, home loans, a lot of loans. Those things can fall well outside of a standard attribution window. And that's, again, where that conversation with the brand team needs to take place to understand and communicate. For you specifically, this is probably what we would recommend. That's right.
Right.
And then another thing too around attribution, we don't always just go towards a conversion. So as you two brought up about paid search, is that we look at the relationship between display driving conversion, but also the relationship between display and paid search. So in a lot of cases, we see where a client will have paid search or shopping taking a lot of credit. But when we run a secondary transference model or kind of a halo effect, we can see that 20% of that may have come from display or from television or from other areas that, because paid search is towards one of the last things you look at, again, depending on the industry,
Right.
other channels can be affected that. So if you pull back from display, paid search would be negatively affected. So we also try to bring things like that into when we get really sophisticated with clients and their spend, to try to help them understand how the things are working in a relationship.
And I want to be fair to maybe some of the standard selections and attribution models that a lot of clients probably opt into, like Last Touch. Since we've talked a lot about the pitfalls of them, what are exactly like the benefits? Is it just that they're easy and cheaper to deploy, or are there other things that are actually weighing into that decision?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think about Last Touch, like we were just saying here, we'll give Last Touch a little love, just like we'll give Search a little love, right? Every channel and every attribution model has its place. I think you hit on it. I think Last Touch, it's universal, right? At the end of the day, you as a marketer, it's one of the first things you're going to learn about when you start, advertising in the various platforms. Every platform has their own derivation, but they all perform very similarly, and their tracking methods are very similar. So the benefits for an analytics person, and even for the finance people, as we're talking about there, those dastardly finance people that never approve budgets. It's just super easy for them to understand, right? It's clean, it's simple, it's what was the last thing that somebody saw before they did whatever the action was that you wanted them to take, and there is a value to that, and I think understanding that value and understanding the audiences for that value, I think, is key. The other thing is that you're usually able to get a very long history of that sort of prediction. Some of these other methods and technologies, we're not able to see that data, going back, days, years, maybe months even. Or even some of the things that Jason's talking about from a model standpoint, there's, ways to refresh models on a really rapid cadence, but what sort of variability are you going to see, day to day, versus, one of the things you're able to do from what Ilon was talking about from testing is, if you implement a test tomorrow from a Last Touch perspective, you'll be able to see that signal almost immediately, depending on the volume, of course, right? If we're talking about cars and homes, maybe that'll take a few more months until that starts to ramp up. But if we're talking about consumables, or convenience store conversions or something of that nature where, that turnaround time is super rapid, you'd actually be able to see that signal in a much more quicker way with the Last Touch model than you would with some others. So again, it's all about that balance, as we're talking about here, what is the objective that you're trying to achieve? And, Last Touch can help you certainly in some of those.
I agree with Steve from a standpoint of testing is the biggest thing, right? It's like, if you're trying to understand different tests, whether it's platform tests, whether it's tactic tests, those types of things that go on and off very quickly, Last Touch is only play, because the spend's not big enough, the activity's not big enough. You need to have some sort of economies of scale, essentially, to get, when you're modeling at higher levels, how this is working. And those types of tests don't show up. They can be infrequent. So when thinking about a media mix, you're looking about the impact of media over 3 years. To understand a 1% or a 0.5% test happening within a 1 month period, some of those bigger modeling solutions just are going to be over baking, and they're never really going to understand that. So if you're trying to understand certain channels to test into, a Pinterest or TikTok or those types of things, those tests take a while to bake, to hit that ground running big enough so they start to show up in some of the bigger modeling solutions too.
So for any accounts that are running kind of like very quick turnaround, Black Friday, Cyber Monday tests, or during this holiday period, it might be really helpful to use Last Touch just to be able to get some results and know whether we're pausing, we're pumping more money into it, for example. Is that what you're describing?
Yeah, absolutely. Depending on your modeling approach and how you're using your attribution setup, in most cases, those smaller tests make more sense to have Last Touch. That being said, we would also never say to not use Last Touch or something else. Attribution, in my mind, is it's a collection of different tools, right? It's like, I look at Last Touch, and then maybe you've got some sort of deterministic approach, and then you've got multi-touch, and then you've got MMM. And then finance has their numbers, right? Because that always happens too. So everybody brings kind of a number, and you look at them and you say, okay, these different, because one approach doesn't answer all the questions, right? There is a hole in each approach that the other approaches are trying to cover up for. So having all of those other tools in your bag essentially can help get to like a better idea of how that campaign's performing. Only using one is when you're kind of like, well, I hope this approach works for all these different scenarios we're trying to think that it's going to work for. And then we believe that number. It's more like we have 3 different numbers trying to predict the same type of campaign or channel level performance. Which do we feel is most accurate with the culmination of those types of numbers, right? That's kind of where we would say to get to, which is, so that's why last click is still really relevant in some cases.
Yeah, and I would reinforce the idea of not only testing, but just as Jason mentioned, multiple tests over time. Too often, I think marketers do a test because they want to test incrementality, and they want to prove the worth of the channel that they're using or the tactic they're using, and they may get a bad result and they pull the plug, which is definitely the wrong move. You need to test multiple times. You need to test over time. And similarly, if you see a result that's too good to be true, don't take that too much to heart either. It can work both ways. So testing a lot is usually the best way to find the most accurate answer.
So this is a great conversation. Could we share an example of what a real life attribution example looks like that you've seen on an account or with a client or elsewhere, where we can show some sort of like result relating to the attribution changes that were made?
Yeah, I can jump in with one that's, near and dear to my heart. So there was a electronics brand that we were working with. We've been engaged with them for, 1, maybe 2 years at this point. And their internal teams had started building their own MMM, right? Tale as old as time, us marketers going along our business. And then Jason comes and tries to ruin it by telling us he knows better with his models. No, just kidding. He does, maybe. But again, it's one of those that there was a situation where we had been optimizing and creating our own sort of, if you will, pseudo-modeled approach off of, ad server data and being able to understand from a digital perspective what was moving the needle to get people to either visit a site or purchase various different products, either from direct to site or from a various retailers. And this MMM that came in specifically was a special brand. Now, this is kind of leading into some of the stuff I think we're going to hit on later, but a special variant of MMM, which was just targeting towards incrementality, which channels were driving the most incrementality of media. And this one ended up saying that you should, slash half of your search spending because it's not really driving any sort of incremental value. Now, again, I think the cuts in total for Q4 budget of like 15 million, they were recommending like $5 million of cuts. And we were like, guys, hold the brakes, Q4, it's like, this is our drive time. You guys want to sell all the stuff. Maybe we should rethink this. And we were able to kind of walk them back from the ledge a little bit with some of the other data that we had together. But again, it was, that push and pull of, the modeled approach really showing that maybe there is something around incrementality with some of these other different channels, but then the reality of, what's the ramifications if we're wrong, right? Some of this information, if you put it together in a one time, not to say that the very smart people at this company weren't taking all the right steps, but, rationalizing these things with business logic, right? And understanding what are you really asking to pull money away from? And maybe there's some floors and ceilings you can put around those parameters to say, there's a minimum threshold that we need to be at for, let's just pick on search again here, to say that you need to be relevant and always at the top of the page when it comes to your brand terms and, winning enough of those non-brand to be relevant. And that's some of the things that we were able to help them with. And luckily they did. We were able to cut in half, which was great. But, I'm sure there's lots of other examples like that. Jason, I'm, picking on you a little bit here, but I'm sure there's plenty where you've seen success on the other side of it too, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why we try to work with all layers of the attribution. We ingest the best data we have. We model it based on the specific outcome and the impact, specifically for media mix, the amount of short-term impact, so 13 weeks of impact. But if you have products that have a longer buying cycle, it's not going to have that, right? If they're higher ticketed prices, right, it's not going to. It's harder to look at those because there's a lot of different data points and training that needs to happen there. Some models are built at a national level to say this is how it's supposed to work across the US. But when we actually run our models at a DMA level or even a zip code level, we find markets that it's working really well versus it doesn't. And so it all having all the context of how it was built, what it was trying to do, what it was built for, may not be aligned to what Steve had set his tests up to do. And so trying to understand kind of what was his test doing versus what our models are doing, and trying to have that definitely is something that we need to take in kind of, or even CMOs or marketing professionals need to think about too when they're trying to evaluate these different outputs from all this media that they're spending.
So far in the conversation, we've definitely heard a lot about, state of business today. We've identified a ton of deficiencies in being able to track data effectively and attribute correct credit to each channel or touch. And we're going to pick up on this conversation in part 2 of this episode. We'll talk about, options for that going forward, and what potential solutions are available for brands and advertisers.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and rate and review us. It helps others find us, and please be sure to tell a friend.
This episode was produced by Merkle with sound and video editing by Craig Zagurski. Our team includes copywriting by Annika Schließman, graphic design by Garrett Rubel, website support by Bella Paul and Emily Chu, and social media and promotion by Gina Astrop, Lily Williams, and Andrea Ratner.
Tune in next time, and until then, I'm Andrew McCartney.
And I'm Gaia Reed. Bye.